The Last Holiday Concert, Chapter 7. The Voice of the People. Hart sat still, hands folded in front of him, but his eyes darted around the music room, looking for clues, watching for danger, trying to see what was coming next. The room was silent. Mr. Minart had been reading at his desk for almost 4 minutes. Hart studied the back of the man's head, looking for anger in his neck and shoulders, examining the way he held his magazine. If another storm was coming, Hart wanted to see it in time to duck for cover. Hart didn't trust the quiet. Mr. Minart was a funnel cloud. Any second now, he might whip around and start ripping things apart. Hart wasn't about to put himself in the path of another tornado. Yesterday's direct hit had been plenty. Off to his right, Hart heard a trickle of whispers. What are we supposed to do? I don't know. I guess just sit here. Is he serious? I think so. He said we can do anything we want, so can we? I don't know. Now be quiet. It got quiet again, but silent children are like rising river. Sooner or later, the water spills over the banks. More whispers. They grew louder. And then came the low talking. Still, Mr. Minor sat and read his magazine. He wanted to leap from his chair. The urge to take charge of his classroom was almost overpowering, but he forced himself to sit and read. As the low talking spread, a few kids kept saying, shh, shh. The shushing couldn't hold back the flow. Then, on the other side of the room, someone must have said something funny. 2 kids started laughing, and the flood broke loose. The noise level in the room rose so fast it took Mr. Minert's breath away, and as more kids talked and laughed, others had to talk still louder and louder in order to be heard above the rising clamor. For a moment, Mr. Minert was sure that the whole 6th grade was packed into the room. He wanted to spin his chair around and give the kids his most withering stare, but he made himself sit still, made himself keep reading. After 3 minutes, the noise was deafening. The room wasn't out of control, but it was close. 3 or 4 guys had started playing baseball with some wadded up paper for a ball and a music book for a bat. A cell phone tweetled, and a girl on one side of the room pulled it out of her purse, jammed it to her ear, and then spun around and waved at her friend who had called her from 30 feet away. A few groups of kids had gone back to the windows to watch the snow come down. 4 girls sat on the floor and began playing rock, paper, scissors, dangerously close to the 3 guys kicking a hacky sack. Everyone else was just milling around, talking and laughing. Hart hadn't budged from his chair. His desk was like his lifeboat, a safe place to watch from. Only 4 other kids besides Hart were still sitting at their desks. 2 of them had begun doing homework, and the other 2 kids, Colleen and Ross, were arguing. Colleen Hester was almost yelling at Ross Eastman, and he was shaking his head and making a face back at her. He didn't much care for either of them, especially Colleen, too bossy. As Hart watched, Colleen and Ross stood up and walked down front to Mr. Minert's desk. It was too loud to hear anything, but Hart saw Colleen say something to Mr. Minert. He looked up at Colleen, and also at Ross, and then Mr. Minert smiled and nodded and shrugged his shoulders, all at the same time. He turned back to his magazine. Colleen tugged on Ross's shirt and pulled him with her until they stood next to the electric piano at the front of the room. Hey, everybody, Colleen yelled. Hey, listen. Please, everybody. Listen. Quiet. The room calmed down a little, and Colleen said, Ross and I want to say something, okay? We just talked to Mr. Minert, and he said if we wanted, we could be in charge of the concert. So we want to get started now, okay? Janie Kingston didn't care much for Colleen either. She stood up and said, I don't think that's fair. How come you should be in charge, just because you talked to Mr. Minert first? And then Tim Miller climbed up on the seat of his desk and made a goofy face and said, Hey, maybe I should be in charge. What do you think, guys? And 4 of Tim's friends started chanting, We want Tim! We want Tim! Ross raised his hands and shouted, Guys, shut up! Come on, shut up! Tim yelled back, No, you shut up! And for 15 seconds, about 40 kids yelled shut up at one another. The shouting burned out, and when it got a little quieter, Ross said, Janie's right, okay? Everything has to be fair, so first everyone's got to sit down. Then we'll have an election to see who runs the concert. You can vote for anyone, like for me, or Janie, or for Colleen. Hey, yelled Tim, what about me? And his friends started chanting again, Tim, Tim, Tim. Ross grinned. Sure, Tim too. But everyone has to sit down, and the person with the most votes wins. Ross grabbed 4 or 5 pieces of paper from his notebook, ripped them into little squares, and started passing them out. As quickly as the room had gotten noisy, it got quiet again. Everyone took a ballot and began writing. Hart almost voted for Janey, but at the last minute he wrote Ross's name. Ross was sort of a brainhead, but he was still a pretty good guy. Colleen took a small drum from a shelf at the front of the room, turned it upside down, and dropped her ballot in. Then she walked up and down the rows until everyone had put one ballot into the drum. She took the drum to a table at the front of the room and dumped it. When she started to unfold the ballot, someone yelled, "Hey, no fair! Someone else should count." And another kid yelled, "Yeah, Mr. Minor should count." Around the room, kids nodded and said, "Yeah, Mr. Minor. Yeah, 'cause he won't cheat. It should be Mr. Minert." Mr. Minor, still reading his magazine, shook his head. Colleen walked over to him and said, "Please, Mr. Minert, everybody wants you to." Mr. Minor was actually relieved, glad to be taking charge of his classroom again, but he didn't show it. He put down his magazine, slowly stood up and rolled his desk chair over to the table. He sat down in front of the heap of ballots and began unfolding each one, sorting the different names into separate piles. The only sound in the room was crinkling paper. When the last ballot was unfolded and sorted, Mr. Minor began counting. He counted the ballots in the first pile, and then counted them a second time. Then he pulled a pad of Post-it notes out of his pocket, wrote down a number, peeled off the note, and stuck it onto the pile. Then he started counting the second pile. There were almost 75 ballots, so it took him about 10 minutes to count them all. When he was done, Mr. Minor looked at the numbers he had written on each pile of ballots. Then he picked up what looked like the biggest stack and counted them again, and then he counted the other big stack. Mr. Minor stood up. He took a deep breath and let it out slowly. He looked around the room, enjoying the silence, enjoying how completely he had everyone's attention. Speaking slowly, he said, "First, I want to thank those few students who voted for me. It was a kind thought, but your votes were wasted. I've already told you that between now and Christmas vacation, I will be in this room only as an observer. Therefore, it is now my duty to announce the results of this free and fair election. The new chorus director for this year's holiday concert is none other than our very own Hart Evans." Chapter 8. Director. After Mr. Minert's announcement, the room was quiet, but only for a second. "No way." Hart gripped the sides of his desk. He shook his head and looked around the room. "No way. I'm not going to be the chorus director. I wasn't even in this election. No way." Colleen jumped to her feet and said, "I can be the director, okay? I know I can do it, and I'll do a good job at it, too." Mr. Minor said, "Colleen, please sit down." Then, turning to Hart, he said, "You already are the new director, Hart. We all heard the rules. Ross said that the whole chorus could vote for anyone. That's what he said. And you didn't complain about that, and like everyone else, you went along with the rules. And you voted, too, right?" Hart gulped. "Well, yeah, sure I voted, but I didn't want to get elected." Hart pointed toward Colleen and Ross. "One of them ought to do it. They're the ones who want to." Mr. Minor shrugged. "Too late. They weren't elected. You were, and that's that." He pulled his chair away from the table where the ballots were and began pushing it back toward his desk. "So, have a very nice concert." Mr. Minor sat down, opened his magazine, and began to read again. Hart didn't know what to do. All the kids were looking at him. He felt embarrassed. Colleen hurried over and stood in front of him. "What do you want us to do first? You heard Mr. Minot. We only have 23 days. We have to get started." Hart looked up at her. Colleen put her hands on her hips and said, "Well, what should we do?" Hart said, "You know the song 'I'm a Little Teapot'? How about you walk down to the front of the room and sing that song for everybody? That would be a good start." Hart's wisecrack got a pretty big laugh, and around the room kids started whispering and talking. Colleen made a pinched face at him. "You think you're so funny. Really, what are you going to do? We have to get started." Hart ignored Colleen and stood up. Waiting for the room to get quiet, Hart thought, "If Mr. Minor wants to be all tough and make me do this, then I can play games too." Hart said, "Okay, listen, everybody. As the new chorus director, I declare that this is a free period, and tomorrow will be a free period too. Chorus is now a free period." And then Hart sat down. A spontaneous cheer filled the room. "Yay! Woo-woo! Awesome! This is great! Yeah, cool!" Still standing there in front of Hart with her hands on her hips, Colleen said, "You are so immature." She turned and stomped back to her desk. In less than a minute the room was as loud as it had been before the election. Reading at his desk, with his ears wide open, once again it took all Mr. Minor's willpower to keep himself from leaping to his feet. He wanted to sweep his eyes across the crowd. He wanted to shout, "Silence!" and snap the room to order. But he thought, no, I'm not going to explode. I'm not going to rant and rave and look like an angry fool again. I'll wait. I'll wait until the noise and the disorder and the confusion overpowers them. A free period. Nobody can stand chaos for long, not even sixth graders. It might take a day or two, but they'll all get sick of it. Hart and his fan club. They think this chorus is a big joke. Well, the joke's on them. By the time these thoughts had run through his mind, Mr. Minor was trying to keep from smiling, and what he really wanted to do was laugh out loud. Hart Evans, the rubber bandit. Hart was now in charge of the chorus, in charge of the big concert. It was too perfect. Mr. Minor knew he was being petty and childish. He knew he was being unprofessional. But at the moment, he didn't care. Mr. Minor was planning to enjoy himself. Soon would come the part where Hart and everyone else would be pleading, begging him to take charge of the chorus and organize the concert, and after they had groveled and whined long enough, he would slowly let himself be talked into it. It was going to be so much fun. There was only one small problem with this analysis. Mr. Minor did not know Hart Evans as well as he thought he did. In fact, none of them knew Hart Evans as well as they thought they did, including Hart Evans himself.